Haman is the second in command. The king appointed him to help oversee all of this land that you and I are looking at. So, a vastly important man, second only to the king. The king says that he ought to be treated properly, like you would treat him. So, at a council meeting, if you would, all the rulers were coming in. Happened to be that Mordecai was the representative, kind of like a congressman for the Jews. When the king would gather everybody together, he had representatives from all the different parts of his. These governments were run very much like we are today. There were elected people from all of his territories who would come in and represent. Now, Mordecai did not represent the Jews in Jerusalem. There was somebody else to do that. Mordecai represented the Jews in Babylon. And because Babylon had such a large percentage of Jews, Mordecai lived pretty much at the palace or nearby. So he was always there. Well, one day on a business meeting, he comes in and there stands Haman. And Haman's waiting for everybody to come in and bow to him because he's the second in command. And the king said, I want you to treat Haman like you would treat me. So Haman's standing there and waiting for everybody to bow to him and to, didn't happen. Now remember, one of the things we said about Haman was his family tree, the Agagites, are the descendants of the Amalekites. And the Amalekite kings believed themselves to be gods. And since he is descendant of these Amalekite kings, he has every reason to expect that folks would understand that he is a god. Maybe not the God, because he's on that throne, but a God deserving of some worship. Mordecai doesn't see it that way. Mordecai knows there's one God, the God in heaven, not the man standing up there on that step above me. So when he comes by, he does not bow down to Haman. Haman even stops to get his attention and still not going to bow. Sorry, we don't do that. Jews got an agreement from the kings a long time ago to not have to bow. But Haman thought that they should. So this sets up an anger in Haman. And as our story opens, Haman's anger had gone so far that he got the king to pass a law saying that all the Jews would be killed on a particular day. Now, we saw that God intervened because God set 12 months back from the time they had begun the plan. So you and I, for safekeeping, let's set it at December 31st. If Haman came up with a plan on January 1st, God made sure that December 31st was picked as the lucky day to kill the Jews. Wasn't very lucky because it's not going to happen. But that was his lucky day. He rolled the dice, remember? And the Purim, he rolled those dice, and that's what the Feast of Purim is all about. It's the fact that God controlled the dice, that God's in control of all things. When Haman cast those dice, God's made sure that December 31st popped up and gave the Jews a full year to prepare for their destruction. Of course, it also gave God a full year to put into place everything that would be necessary to get the Jews safe. Mordecai's part, Esther's part, and that's what we want to talk about tonight is Esther's part. There's a lot that goes on in our story. The death is right around the corner. They're getting closer and closer and closer to it now. And we're running out of time. Mordecai goes to his niece, Esther. Not a bad looking tomato. He goes to his niece and he says, well, actually his cousin. But remember, he's adopted her, so it's his daughter now. Sweetheart, got some bad news for you. Oh, how bad can it be? I'm living here in the palace. Yeah, you're living here in the palace until December 31st. And then someone's going to come by and kill you. Because, and he goes on and explains to her the whole story that I just explained to you. And how Haman is going to murder her. Because the king said it was okay to kill all the Jews in the land. All the Jews everywhere throughout his kingdom. December 31st, they all get annihilated. So here's our problem, he says to her. We're all going to die unless we do something. What can we do? See, one of the problems is this. The law of the Medes and the Persians doesn't change, and it isn't altered. You can't unwrite the law you wrote. Because remember, the king of the Medes and the Persians was a god, and gods don't make mistakes. So the king can't say, oh, I made a bad law, please erase that from the books. Can't do that. Esther knows, though, that the king is the only one who can do anything at all about the situation. But remember, this is Iran hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, even before Jesus was born. You think they're radical now. Let me tell you, these were radical peoples. So much so that the queen could not come to see the king unless the king asked her to come. Yeah. If she went in, honey, can I see you? She could be killed. That's the way things were. She can't go in and see the king because it could cost her life. But hey, Mordecai comes and says, you got to go see the king. And get killed? I don't think so. Her natural response is the same one you and I would have. I ain't going to do it. But then he explains, you're the only hope we have. If you don't see the king, who will? You can't let Haman change his mind because he's not going to. So Esther says, tell you what, and this is our verse for her right here. Go gather together. Okay. She changes her mind on a condition. Go gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan. That's the capital city. And fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast in like manner. So will I go unto the king. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, I will go see the king. Notice what she says. Which is not according to the law. I can't do that. Legally, I can't do that. And if I perish, I perish. I'm going to go see him in 3 days. It's illegal to me to do it. I'm going to do it, though, because we've gone to fast and pray, and God is going to have to make a way for me. But if God doesn't, and I die, at least I'm dying doing a good thing. Well, she goes in, bats her eyes a little bit, like women are wanting to do. And the king melts. He holds out his hand and sees her back there. She doesn't ask to come in. She just stands by the back door, kind of flirts with him from a distance. And the king says, sweetheart, you want to come on in? He could tell she's got something to say, but she doesn't know exactly how to bring this up. Because it's not something you can necessarily talk about. Remember now, the king has signed the decree saying you can kill all the Jews. So how do I tell my husband, first of all, that I'm a Jew and he's going to kill me? And how do I tell him that he made a mistake when he doesn't make mistakes? So she's got a lot of problems here. So she says, I want to invite you to a banquet. Really? You came all this way? You stood back there? Sure. So they set up for a banquet. And she has a banquet only so she could ask for a second banquet. The whole thing about the first banquet is to get to the second one. See, now things are working out here. God is in the background listening to all these prayers. In the meantime, while they're having this banquet and waiting for the next one to come, the king happens to read the chronicles of his life and discovers that Mordecai had saved his life. Remember, all this is occurring while they're fasting and praying. Fasting and praying, the queen goes in. I'd like to invite you to a banquet. All right, we'll set it up for such and such a date, such and such a time. Great. In the meantime, he's kind of excited. He can't sleep. He's reading through the story, and he finds out that there was a murder attempt on his life, an assassination attempt against his life, and that Mordecai discovered it and reported the man and saved his life. So he asked, what have we done for Mordecai? You haven't even sent him a thank you card or nothing. Here's a guy who saves your life, and you don't even acknowledge it. So the king feels real bad. So he gets, remember from last week, he asks Haman what he should do. Haman, of course, thinks the king is talking about himself, Haman, and so he has this elaborate scheme to dress himself up like the king, put himself on the king's prized horse, and parade him up and down, that the king should carry the reins and lead the horse up and down the streets while the people cheer for Haman. The king said, that's a great idea. That's what I want you to do for Mordecai. I want you to lead the horse that he's riding up and down the street so everybody can cheer for Mordecai. What? Really infuriates him. He builds this gallows like 75 feet high, and he's going to hang Haman up there. And the day is coming closer. They're building the gallows while she's planning that second banquet. Haman is feeling pretty good because the Jews are just a couple of days away from dying, like the next day. He comes in. The queen is sitting on a couch, getting ready for the banquet. Haman sees her over there. She invites him. He overreads it, or she trapped him, one or the other. Because he comes flying on over there, sits right next to her, grabs her, gets ready to lay the big smooch on her. All of a sudden, the king walks in, and she said, he grabbed me. And the king grabs him. And they execute him on the gallows he was making for Haman. The queen explains to the king that he had signed a law that was going to kill her tomorrow. Mordecai is called in. What can we do? They begin to brainstorm. The queen is there. Mordecai is there. The king is there, and probably a few others. Well, king, you can't go back on your word. You can't erase that law. It has to take place tomorrow. But here's what I can do. I can write a second law that says the Jews have the right to defend themselves. And if anybody comes after the Jews can kill that man. At least now they got a fighting chance. If the Jew thinks you're going to hurt him, he can kill you. So don't think about killing him. Don't think about hurting him, because he's got the right now to protect himself, to the right to bear arms and to protect himself with lethal force. The king gave that to all the Jews throughout all the land. So, needless to say, because Haman wasn't there and this new law was written as a companion to the old law, the Jews were spared. The Jews celebrate the Feast of Purim, and they celebrate it because it's the lots. We call it the Feast of Lots or the Feast of Purim. It means that was the dice, the lots that the pur is what the Iranians called it. The Jews called them lots. You and I call them dice. Same thing. Casting of them stones. And so here now we have her. And here is the greatness of her story, is this one last sentence about her. If I perish, I perish. The whole story is right here in 4:16. If I perish, I perish. That was her courage. So let's take a look at this young lady. First of all, let's take a look at the good. The good is, one thing is that, forget about that persistent in prayer. I forgot to erase that from something else. But beauty and character is the first thing we notice about her. And it's something that the king noticed. The king noticed not only that it won his heart. She wins the heart of the king of Persia by both her beauty and her character. She's trained up. She is well bred. She is well educated. And she has the kind of character that you want to have in a person. Something that was missing in a lot of people in their day and time. But she had it. That was good. But the other thing is courage. She did show courage. If I perish, I perish. But her courage wasn't just blind. It wasn't, well, God will take care of me. No, she was courageous because she planned for her courage. She was courageous because she said, here's what we'll do. I'll go see the king in 3 days. But before I do that, I want you to fast and pray for 3 days. And after 3 days of fasting and praying, I'll go see the king. And if I perish, I perish. But if I perish, it'll be because God does not hear and answer prayer. He just doesn't. Pretty good, safe bet, if I can use the word, since we're talking about casting of lots. Pretty good, safe bet that God does hear and answer prayer. And so, although, yes, courage, but she did plan well. All right, fast and pray. Nobody eats, nobody drinks. Gather everybody here in Shushan. You get all the Jews thinking and praying and asking God for this one thing for the next 3 days. Give grace to the king, or give grace to the queen. Give her favor with the king. Over and over and over. No eating, no drinking. Keep that. Because, hey, why should I pray? Because you're going to die in about a week if you don't. She's going to go and see him. There's only a few days left to live. If he kills her, she's just going to die a few days ahead of everybody else. Because we're coming up on it. We're within that last week. And if you don't pray, God's going to let you all die. Pretty good reason to pray. You can hear Mordecai convincing everybody. Because you're going to die if you don't. Oh, then I'll pray. Pray for the queen, because if she dies, you're next. See, that's a good visual. If she dies, I'm next. I better pray for her, because I don't want to be next. And so we see her courage. That's true. If I perish, I perish. But on her part, I think she thought it was a pretty big if, because she had to think that God was in control. Because didn't God already get the dice to give them a complete year? The most time you can have is what the dice gave them. The full length of a year. Not 360 days, but a full 364 by their calendar. I think maybe 360, whatever their calendar ran. They had the full year to get ready and prepare for this. The most time that could be given was given to them. And here we are down to the final week of it. And God is working it out so the king will have favor with her. She will get to have 2 banquets, so she'll at least be well fed before she goes. And on the second banquet, she springs the trap and everything is done. All within a couple of days after they fasted and prayed. And so here they are, yes, courage, but well planned out. You can't just blindly say God will take care of it unless you have a promise. Because if you don't have a promise, you probably don't have a prayer. This third thing we see was that she was open to advice and willing to follow it. When her uncle Mordecai came to her and said, sweetheart, here's what you got to do. You got to go see the king. I ain't going to go see the king. He'll kill me. Yeah, but we need you to. Hard advice for a young girl. Probably not much older than my cake, if she's even as old as my cake. And to say to my cake, you have to go see Michael, knowing full well that Michael could cut her head off if he didn't want to see her. So she goes, she sees the king, but she didn't know up until he said, because when he points his finger, he could have been pointing saying, somebody get that girl. So when he points his hand at her, and then when he motions like this, then it's okay. What would you like for me to do for you? How about you let me have a banquet for you? Sure. I like food. I like you. It'd be great. We'll invite a few folks. And then like I said, the first one's only so she can get the second one. And the second one was really to give Haman an opportunity to be around her so she can bring a trap on you. Pretty smart girl. I got to say, not only was she willing to take advice, but she could follow it. And she could see where this thing is going. Thinking girl. Pretty smart. But one of the other good things about her was this, that she seemed, now at first it didn't seem that way, but ultimately she was more concerned with others than she was about herself, which is always an important trait in all of our lives to have. People who have a lot of problems are people who are self-centered. People who see themselves as the middle of the universe and everybody's looking at them and that's not true. Walk through the mall and you'll see that nobody even notices you. Ask for help. Nobody will give it to you. Why? Because they don't care about you. But people who think that they're the middle, that everybody's looking at them, don't help anybody either. By helping other people, you find out that there are people with bigger problems than your own. You don't notice that unless you reach out. And then all of a sudden you find out, wow. Somebody said if we all put our problems out on the front porch and people could go by and look at your problems and look at and go through the neighborhood and decide which problems they want, people would just go home and keep their own. Because they find out that everybody's probably got more problems or worse problems than they've got. But Esther, pretty good. She was more concerned about the Jewish people than she was about herself. They're all about to die. So if I perish in the opportunity to save them, then I perish. But I've got to do something to save my people. And she does. We wouldn't have a Jesus if we didn't have an Esther. You wouldn't be getting ready to celebrate Christmas if it wasn't for her. Deciding this, going in and seeing the king for us. See, we don't sometimes understand how complex everything is that God is doing, but God's working all things out for his purposes. Now, did she realize that she had a purpose? As a young girl growing up there, she was probably mad and angry that why do we have to grow up in this foreign land? Why can't I be back with my people? How come I didn't get to go on the first trip back or the second trip back? Well, probably because that first trip was 70 years ago and you weren't born yet, girl. Maybe on the last trip about 13 years ago, maybe she could have gone there. How come I didn't get to go back to Jerusalem? Don't you think I'd like to go? Because God had a plan for you. God put you in a position, in a situation. Well, let's go on. Before I bring that up. Anything bad said about her? Nope. So far, we haven't been having a whole lot of bad said about anybody. Except for Haman. But did we get to Haman yet? No, I think I got to Mordecai, and I talked about Haman during Mordecai. Mordecai, nothing bad was said about him. Nehemiah, nothing was said. Ezra. These last couple of folks, nothing bad's been said about Zerubbabel or Ezra or Nehemiah or Mordecai or Esther. Wow, everybody's getting better. Not necessarily, but God's purpose in all of this isn't to shine light on them. It's to keep the light on him. It's to get the Jews back home. No recorded, not that she was perfect. There just isn't anything recorded about her. We don't have any bad news, anything hiding in the presses, waiting to come out on the queen. So far, she's doing a good job. So that brings us then down to the lesson that we have on her life. And really, as you can see, we have three of them. First of all, serving God often comes with a risk. Missionaries will tell you, there are some risks in being a missionary. There are some risks associated with being a Christian. When you stand up and tell people that you're a Christian, you are assuming some risk. Because not everybody likes the idea. When you stand up for Jesus, you'll find out that a lot of people will stand up against you. In her case, to do what God wanted her to do could have meant her life. Serving God isn't always easy, but it's always the right thing to do. And we learn that from her. She decided she would serve the Lord. If I perish, not without risk. But wow, what an honor. I mean, this woman is in the books for one thing. If I perish, I perish. If she didn't say that, there would be no book of Esther. We wouldn't know about Mordecai. We wouldn't even know about Haman. We wouldn't even know the Jews because they'd all be dead. She saved her people. She saved her people. That's huge. Can you imagine if you were the person who allowed the rest of look at the Bible would have stopped right there at Nehemiah. Nehemiah, nothing after that. The book of Psalms and the book of Job, the book of Proverbs. That's it. But you wouldn't have no New Testament. Okay, you'd have the prophets because they all wrote before her. But you got no New Testament because she isn't there to save the Jews. Second point is this: God has a purpose for the situation we are in. God put you where he put you for a reason. It's up to us to discover that reason and to be there for it. Why do I have to? Well, why am I the queen? Probably you're going to have something to do. Then one day her uncle comes and says, sweetheart, I need the queen to do something for her people. What? All of a sudden she discovers what her purpose in her situation was. And there is a purpose in all of our situations. We have to look around and see what it is. There's a reason you are at the place you are at. There's a reason that you have the job you have. There's a reason you're in the school you're in. There's a reason that you're in the family you're in. There's a reason you're in the church you're in. All of these things, God has a purpose for our situation. And it's up to us to discover that. And when somebody comes knocking on the door and says, I need you to do this to save this or to save that, probably that's when you're going to find out what your situation is all about. And then courage. But courage should not replace planning. You notice she said, I'll go see the king. And she didn't just go in and march right in. She said, tell you what, let's pray about that. Give me 3 days of fasting and prayer. And if you will pray and fast for 3 days, I'll go in and see the king. But I'll go in and see the king because God's going to take care. God's going to hear and answer prayer. God's going to hear and answer prayer. But courage does not replace planning. So she planned, and that's something for us to remember too. Always plan, always prepare, always trust God. But I'm telling you, that thing about fasting and prayer, not a bad thing to follow up on.